Hello everyone, I'm Elena, your host for today's lesson.
If you are new here, let me quickly tell you something about our channel. We upload a new English learning video every single day to help you improve your English faster, step by step, and become a confident English speaker. In today's episode, we are going to explore something extremely powerful for your English journey. Today's lesson is an everyday advanced English vocabulary improvement masterclass. In this video, you will gradually improve your English vocabulary from beginner level all the way to advanced and near native level, from A1 to C2, step by step. But this lesson is not just about learning words, because simply memorizing vocabulary does not make you fluent. The real goal is to help you actually use those words in real-life conversations. That is why, throughout this lesson, we will practice natural English conversations, everyday situations, and practical examples that will help you understand how native speakers really communicate. During this masterclass, you will learn how simple everyday words can grow into more advanced and more expressive vocabulary. You will see how basic English can transform into more natural, fluent, and confident speech. And most importantly, you will practice speaking along with me so that these new words become part of your active vocabulary, not just something you recognize when reading or listening. By the end of this lesson, you will notice that your English vocabulary feels richer, your sentences will begin to sound more natural, and your confidence in speaking English will become stronger. You will also understand how native speakers choose words in everyday conversations and how you can start doing the same. So if your goal is to sound more natural, think in English more easily, and gradually move from beginner level to advanced fluency, then you are in the right place. Today, we will learn together, practice together, and build your English, step by step. Before we begin the lesson, make sure to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our daily English learning videos. These lessons are designed to help you improve your listening, vocabulary, speaking confidence, and overall fluency. Now take a deep breath, relax your mind, and get ready to learn and practice English with me. Let's begin our vocabulary masterclass. Let's start with something very simple. Think about your everyday life for a moment. From the moment you wake up in the morning until you go to sleep at night, you are constantly describing things, explaining situations, sharing opinions, and talking about your experiences. All of these daily conversations require vocabulary, and the stronger your vocabulary becomes, the easier it becomes to express your thoughts clearly and confidently. Many English learners believe that fluency only comes from learning complex grammar rules, but the truth is, vocabulary plays a much bigger role in everyday communication. When you know the right words, speaking becomes easier, smoother, and much more natural. Imagine waking up in the morning and describing your day in English. A beginner might say something very simple like, "I wake up early and I feel good today." This sentence is perfectly correct and useful, but as your English grows, you begin to express the same idea in richer ways. Instead of saying, "I feel good today," you might say, "I feel refreshed this morning," or "I feel energized today," Or even, I feel incredibly motivated to start my day. Notice how the idea is the same, but the vocabulary becomes more expressive. This is exactly how English develops from A1 level to C2 level, not by replacing simple English completely, but by expanding it and making it more flexible. One important thing to understand about vocabulary is that native speakers rarely search for complicated words just to sound intelligent. Instead, they choose words that describe their thoughts more precisely. For example, the word good is extremely common in English, but depending on the situation, native speakers often replace it with more I-specific vocabulary. Instead of saying, "The movie was good," someone might say, "The movie was entertaining," or "The movie was fascinating," or "The movie was inspiring." Each of these words communicates a slightly different feeling, and learning these variations is one of the fastest ways to improve your English. Now let's practice something together. Imagine that you are describing your morning routine. A beginner sentence might sound like this: I had a good morning today. That sentence is clear, but we can improve it in many ways. You could say, I had a pleasant morning today, or I had a productive morning today, or I had a relaxing morning today. Each word creates a slightly different picture of your experience. When you learn vocabulary in this way, you are not just memorizing words, you are learning how to express real experiences. Now, let's take a moment to practice this idea together. Imagine you are talking to a friend about your morning. Try saying this sentence slowly in your mind. This morning was very good. Now let's expand it. This morning was very peaceful. Or, this morning was very productive. Or, this morning was surprisingly refreshing. When you practice transforming simple sentences into richer expressions, you train your brain to think more naturally in English. Vocabulary growth also depends on context. Words become powerful when you see them used in real situations. Let's imagine another everyday scenario. You meet a friend in the afternoon, and they ask you a very common question. How has your day been so far? A beginner answer might be something like, my day was good. But let's expand that idea. You might say, so a day has been quite busy. Or, my day has been pretty relaxing so far. Or, my day has been surprisingly productive. Notice how these small vocabulary changes make your answer sound much more natural. Now let's practice another small exercise together. Imagine someone asks you this question. How was your morning? Try answering with a richer expression. You might say, my morning was calm and productive. Or, my morning was a bit hectic but still manageable. Or, my morning was slow but very relaxing. Practicing these kinds of responses trains your brain to connect vocabulary with real-life situations. Another important step in vocabulary improvement is learning how small descriptive words can change the tone of a sentence. Words like very, quite, fairly, and extremely help you add more nuance to your speech. For example, instead of saying, I am tired, you might say, I am extremely tired. Or, I am quite tired today. Or, I am a little tired, but still energetic. These tiny adjustments help you sound more natural and more expressive. Let's practice another example together. Imagine you had a long day at work or at school. A simple sentence might be, "Today was difficult." Now try expanding that idea. "Today was quite challenging," or "Today was extremely demanding," or "Today was mentally exhausting." Each expression communicates a slightly different level of difficulty. When you begin to recognize these differences, your vocabulary becomes more precise and more flexible. Now let's imagine another everyday conversation. You meet someone in the evening, and they ask you about your day. You might say something like, "Today was interesting." But you can expand that idea. Depending on your experience, you might say, "Today was incredibly interesting because I learned something new," or "Today was unexpectedly interesting," or "Today turned out to be quite fascinating." Again, the structure is simple, but the vocabulary becomes more expressive. One powerful technique for vocabulary improvement is something called word substitution practice. This means taking a simple sentence and replacing one word with several stronger alternatives. For example, let's take the word big. Instead of always saying big, you could say huge, massive, enormous, or gigantic. Each word communicates size, but adds a slightly different tone. Now let's try a small speaking exercise. Imagine you are describing a city you visited. A beginner sentence might be, "The city was big." Now expand it. "The city was enormous," or "The city was incredibly massive," or "The city felt huge and lively." This exercise trains your brain to replace basic vocabulary with richer alternatives. Another everyday word that learners use frequently is happy. Of course, this is a very useful word, but English has many ways to describe happiness. You might feel excited, delighted, thrilled, pleased, or content. Each word expresses happiness in a slightly different emotional shade. For example, if something exciting happens, you might say, "I am thrilled." If something peaceful makes you happy, you might say, "I feel content." Let's practice that idea together. Imagine you just finished an important task successfully. Instead of saying, "I am happy," try saying, "I am really pleased with the result." Or, "I am absolutely thrilled about how it turned out." These small changes make your speech sound more natural and more expressive. Now, let's explore another very common everyday word, the word interesting. Many learners use this word very frequently, but native speakers often replace it with more descriptive alternatives. Instead of saying, "The book was interesting," someone might say, "The book was fascinating," or "The book was captivating," or "The book was thought-provoking." Each expression gives more information about the experience. Let's practice again. Imagine you watched a documentary last night. Instead of saying, "The documentary was interesting," you might say, "The documentary was incredibly fascinating," or "The documentary was deeply informative," or "The documentary was surprisingly engaging." By practicing these variations, your vocabulary begins to grow naturally. Another powerful strategy for vocabulary improvement is learning vocabulary in pairs or groups of related words. For example, when you learn the word tired, you can also learn related expressions like exhausted, drained, fatigued, and worn out. Each of these words describes tiredness, but they vary in intensity and tone. Let's imagine another real-life situation. You meet a friend after a long day, and they ask how you feel. Instead of saying, "I am tired," you might say, "I feel completely exhausted today," or "I feel mentally drained," or "I am a bit worn out after such a long day." Practicing vocabulary through situations like this helps you remember it more easily. Now let's do a short reflection exercise. Think about your day today. Try describing it, using at least 3 different descriptive words. You might say, "Today was busy, productive, and slightly exhausting." Or you might say, "Today was calm, relaxing, and surprisingly enjoyable." This kind of reflection practice helps you connect vocabulary to your real experiences. As your vocabulary grows, something very interesting begins to happen. Your listening comprehension improves as well. When you hear native speakers talk, you begin to recognize more words, more expressions, and more subtle meanings. Conversations start to feel clearer and easier to understand. And this is exactly why vocabulary is one of the most important foundations of fluency. Another important point is repetition. Vocabulary becomes permanent when you encounter the same word many times, in different situations. For example, if you hear the word productive used when describing a workday, a study session, or even a morning routine, your brain begins to understand its meaning deeply. Over time, you start using it naturally, without thinking too much. Let's continue with another small speaking practice. Imagine you are talking about your work or study session today. Instead of saying, "I did a lot today," you might say, "I had a very productive day today," or "I managed to accomplish quite a lot today." These expressions sound natural and are commonly used in everyday conversations. Now think about the opposite situation. Sometimes your day might not feel productive at all. Instead of saying, "I did nothing today," you might say, "Today was a bit unproductive," or "I didn't accomplish as much as I hoped today." These kinds of expressions help you sound more natural and emotionally expressive. As you continue practicing vocabulary like this, your sentences gradually become richer and more flexible. And the most important thing to remember is that vocabulary improvement does not happen overnight. It happens through consistent exposure, practice, and real usage. Every new word you learn becomes another tool that helps you express your thoughts more clearly. So take a moment right now and think about 3 words you learned in this lesson so far. Try forming a short sentence with each one. For example, you might say, "This morning felt refreshing," or "Today was quite productive," or "I feel slightly exhausted after such a busy day." Practicing sentences like this helps turn passive vocabulary into active vocabulary. And as we continue through this masterclass, we will keep expanding your vocabulary step by step, moving from simple everyday words to more advanced and expressive vocabulary. That will help you sound more confident, more fluent, and more natural in English conversations. Let's continue building your vocabulary by exploring how small changes in word choice can transform the way you sound in English conversations. Many learners reach a point where they understand basic English very well, but their speaking still feels limited. because they rely on the same simple words, again and again. The key to moving from basic communication toward more natural fluency is learning how to expand familiar ideas with richer vocabulary. When you learn to express the same thought in several different ways, your English begins to feel flexible, expressive, and much closer to how native speakers communicate in everyday situations. Think about a very common sentence that many learners say during daily conversations. Someone asks you about your day, and you answer, "It was a busy day." This sentence is clear and useful. However, there are many ways to describe a busy day. In English, you might say, "Today was quite hectic," which suggests that many things were happening quickly at the same time. You might say, "Today was incredibly demanding," which shows that the tasks required a lot of effort. Or you could say, "Today was packed with activities," which gives the listener a clear image of a full schedule. All of these sentences describe the same basic idea, but the vocabulary adds personality and detail. Now imagine you are telling a friend about your afternoon. A very simple sentence could be, "I had a meeting, and then I studied." That sentence communicates the key facts, but it does not show the full experience. You could expand it by saying, "I had an important meeting this afternoon, and afterward I spent some time studying." Or you might say, "I attended a meeting earlier today, and later I focused on my studies for a while." Notice how these sentences sound smoother and more natural. When you practice expanding simple sentences like this, you train your brain to speak with greater clarity and variety. Let's practice a small speaking exercise together. Imagine someone asks you, "What did you do this afternoon?" Take a moment and create a response in your mind. Perhaps you might say, "I spent the afternoon working on a project." You could also say, "I dedicated most of my afternoon to finishing an important task." Or maybe, "I used the afternoon to concentrate on my work." Each of these responses sounds natural, but the vocabulary creates slightly different tones and levels of formality. Vocabulary improvement also becomes easier when you learn to describe experiences more vividly. For example, the word interesting is very common, but it can sometimes feel vague. When native speakers describe something that captured their attention, they often choose words that are more descriptive. Instead of saying, "The conversation was interesting," someone might say, "The conversation was engaging," which suggests that it held their attention. They might say, "The conversation was insightful," which implies that it provided useful understanding. Or they might say, "The conversation was fascinating," which suggests strong curiosity and interest. Now imagine that you watched a documentary last night. A simple sentence, could be, "The documentary was interesting." Let's expand that idea with richer vocabulary. You might say, "The documentary was incredibly fascinating because it explained things in a very clear way." Another option could be, "The documentary was very insightful, and it made me think about the topic differently." Or you could say, "The documentary was extremely engaging from beginning to end." By practicing sentences like this, you begin to build a more expressive vocabulary. Naturally, another useful strategy for vocabulary development is describing emotions with greater detail. Many learners use the words happy, sad, or excited, which are perfectly correct and useful. However, English contains many other words that describe emotions more precisely. For example, if you feel very happy because something good happened, you might say, you feel delighted. If you are excited about a future event, you might say, you feel eager. If you feel peaceful and satisfied with life at a particular moment, you might say, you feel content. Let's imagine a small everyday situation. You just finished a task that took several hours to complete. A simple reaction might be, I am happy that it is finished. But you could express the same idea more naturally by saying, I feel relieved that it's finally finished. You might say, I'm really pleased with the result. Or you could say, I feel incredibly satisfied now that the work is done. Each expression communicates the same situation, but adds emotional depth. Now take a moment to practice with me. Imagine you just received good news from a friend or colleague. Instead of saying, I am happy for you, try expanding the idea. You might say, I'm really happy for you. That's wonderful news. Another possibility could be, I'm genuinely delighted to hear that. Or you might say, that's fantastic news. I'm so pleased for you. Practicing these variations helps you sound more natural and conversational. Vocabulary growth also involves understanding how certain words frequently appear together in natural English. These combinations are sometimes called natural expressions or word partnerships. For example, native speakers often say, make progress instead of do progress. They say, gain experience rather than get experience. In some contexts, learning these natural combinations helps your speech sound smoother and more accurate. Let's explore a few examples. If you want to talk about improving your English, you might say, I want to improve my English. That sentence is perfect, but you might also hear someone say, I want to make real progress in my English. Another natural expression could be, I want to expand my English vocabulary. Or perhaps, I want to strengthen my communication skills. These variations give you more ways to express the same goal. Now imagine someone asks you why you are studying English. A simple answer might be, I want to speak English well. Let's expand that idea into more expressive responses. You might say, I want to speak English more confidently. You could say, I want to communicate clearly with people from different countries. Or you might say, I want to develop strong English communication skills for my career. These answers show how vocabulary helps you express your motivation more clearly. Another powerful technique for vocabulary improvement is storytelling. When you describe events from your life, you naturally use a wider range of words. For example, imagine describing a small experience from yesterday. A simple version might sound like this. Yesterday, I met a friend, and we talked for a long time. That sentence communicates the event, but it can become more expressive with additional vocabulary. You might say, yesterday I met a friend for coffee, and we spent a long time talking about our recent experiences. Or you could say, yesterday I ran into a friend unexpectedly, and we ended up having a really long and enjoyable conversation. Another possibility might be, yesterday I caught up with a friend and we had a great conversation about life and work. Each version adds more, non-tail, and personality. Let's practice together again. Imagine that you are describing a relaxing evening. A very simple sentence might be, I stayed at home and watched a movie. Now expand that idea in your mind. You could say, I stayed at home and watched a really entertaining movie. Or, I spent the evening at home watching a fascinating movie. Or even, I had a relaxing evening at home and enjoyed watching a great movie. This practice helps you move from simple communication to more expressive storytelling. Another aspect of vocabulary development involves describing actions more precisely. For example, instead of always using the verb go, English often uses more specific verbs, depending on the situation. Instead of saying go quickly, someone might say rush. Instead of saying go slowly, someone might say wander. Instead of saying go quietly, someone might say sneak. These more specific verbs help you create clearer mental images. When speaking, imagine describing a busy morning. Instead of saying, I went to work quickly, you might say, I rushed to work because I was running late. If you were enjoying a slow walk through a park, you might say, I wandered through the park for a while. If you wanted to describe moving quietly, you might say, he sneaked into the room without making any noise. Each verb paints a more detailed picture. Let's do another small practice moment. Think about a time when you visited a new place. Instead of saying, I went around the city, you might say, I explored the city. Instead of saying, I looked at the shops, you could say, I browsed through the shops. These verbs add richness and precision to your sentences. As your vocabulary continues to grow, you will also become more comfortable expressing opinions. Many learners rely heavily on the phrase, I think, which is perfectly correct, but English provides many other ways to introduce an opinion. For example, you might say, in my opinion, or from my perspective, or personally, I believe. These variations help your speech feel more natural and engaging. Imagine someone asks you about a new restaurant in your city. Instead of simply saying, I think it is good, you might say, in my opinion, the restaurant is excellent. Or you could say, from my perspective, the food there is really impressive. Or perhaps, personally, I believe it's one of the best places in the area. These expressions add variety and confidence to your speech. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect on the words you have encountered so far in this lesson. Try forming a few sentences using them. For example, you might say, today was a productive day because I finished several tasks. You could say, yesterday I had a fascinating conversation with a friend. Or perhaps, this evening feels calm and relaxing after such a busy day. When you practice forming sentences like these, you strengthen your ability to use vocabulary actively, rather than simply recognizing it. As we move forward in this master class, we will continue expanding your vocabulary. Step by step, you will encounter more expressive words, more natural phrases, and more practical conversation. Use examples that will help you communicate like a confident English speaker. Each new word becomes a tool that helps you describe your experiences, share your ideas, and connect with people more clearly. Let's continue strengthening your vocabulary by looking at how everyday conversations become richer when you add descriptive language. One of the most effective ways to improve your vocabulary is by describing daily experiences with more detail and precision. Every day you experience situations that can become opportunities to practice English. You wake up, prepare for the day, interact with people, solve problems, relax in the evening, and reflect on what happened. Each of these moments can be described in simple English, but they can also be expanded with stronger vocabulary that makes your speech sound more natural and expressive. Think about the moment when you wake up in the morning. A very simple sentence could be, "I woke up early today." That sentence is clear and correct. However, there are many ways to make the sentence more expressive. You might say, "I woke up surprisingly early today." Another possibility could be, "I woke up earlier than usual today." Or you might say, "I woke up feeling refreshed and ready to start the day." Notice how the additional words create a clearer picture of the experience. Instead of just describing the action, you are also describing how the moment felt. Let's imagine a typical morning routine. Many English learners might say something like, "I made breakfast and drank coffee." That sentence communicates the idea, but it can be expanded easily. For example, you could say, "I prepared a simple breakfast and enjoyed a cup of coffee." Another option might be, "I made a quick breakfast and slowly drank my morning coffee." Or you could say, "I prepared breakfast and relaxed for a few minutes while drinking coffee." Each version adds more detail and creates a smoother, more natural sentence. Now, let's practice a short speaking exercise together. Imagine you are telling someone about your morning. You might say, "This morning started very calmly." You could also say, "This morning began in a very peaceful way." Or perhaps, "My morning started slowly, but turned out to be quite productive." Practicing sentences like this helps your brain become comfortable with different vocabulary combinations. Another common topic in everyday conversations is talking about work or study. Many learners often use the sentence, "I worked a lot today." That sentence is understandable, but there are many richer ways to describe the same idea. You might say, "I had a very demanding workday today." Or you might say, "I spent most of the day focusing on an important project." Another possibility could be, "I had a really productive day at work today." Each of these sentences sounds natural and communicates the situation more clearly. Let's explore another example. Imagine that you are explaining a busy schedule to a friend. Instead of saying, "My schedule was full today," you might say, "My schedule was completely packed today." You could also say, "I had a very tight schedule today." Or perhaps, "My day was filled with meetings and tasks." These expressions are commonly used by native speakers when describing a busy day. Now let's practice again together. Imagine someone asks you, "What kept you busy today?" You might answer, "I spent most of the day finishing an important assignment." Another response could be, "I was busy preparing for an upcoming project." Or you could say, "I was occupied with several tasks throughout the day." Practicing these responses helps you develop flexibility in your speech. Vocabulary improvement also involves learning how to describe experiences that are unexpected. In daily life, many things happen that surprise us. How instead of always using the word surprising, English offers many alternatives that create a stronger impact. For example, you might say something was unexpected, astonishing, or remarkable. Each of these words describes surprise, but with slightly different intensity. Imagine you met an old friend by accident while walking through the city. A simple sentence might be, "I met an old friend today, and it was surprising." However, you could make the sentence more natural by saying, "I unexpectedly ran into an old friend today." Another possibility might be, "I had a surprising encounter with an old friend today." Or you could say, "It was quite remarkable to suddenly meet an old friend today." These variations make the conversation feel more vivid and engaging. Let's do a small reflection exercise. Think about something unexpected that happened recently. Try describing it using richer vocabulary. You might say, "I had an unexpected opportunity today," or "I experienced a surprising moment during my day." Practicing sentences like these allows you to connect vocabulary with your real experiences. Another useful area of vocabulary development involves describing time and duration. In everyday conversations, we often talk about how long something took or how quickly something happened. Instead of always saying very fast or very slow, English offers many descriptive expressions. For example, you might say something happened rapidly, gradually, or suddenly. These words help you describe actions with more precision. Imagine describing how you completed a task. Instead of saying, "I finished it very fast," you might say, "I finished it surprisingly quickly." Or you could say, "I completed the task much faster than expected." Another possibility could be, "I managed to finish the task in a short amount of time." These expressions sound smoother and more natural. Now imagine the opposite situation. Sometimes tasks take longer than expected. And instead of saying, "It took a very long time," you might say, "It took longer than I anticipated." Another expression could be, "The process was quite time-consuming." Or you could say, "It required a considerable amount of time." These phrases are frequently used in professional and everyday conversations. Let's practice again. Imagine someone asks you about a task you completed today. So you might say, "The task was challenging, but I managed to complete it successfully." Another response could be, "The task took longer than expected, but it was worth the effort." Or perhaps, "It was a time-consuming task, but I learned a lot from the experience." These types of sentences help you communicate both the action and the emotion behind it. As your vocabulary expands, you will also become more comfortable expressing personal opinions and reflections. In everyday conversations, people frequently share their thoughts about experiences. For example, after finishing a long day, you might want to reflect on how it felt. Thus, instead of saying, "Today was good," You could say, "Today was quite rewarding." Another possibility could be, "Today felt very satisfying." Or you might say, "Today was both challenging and fulfilling." These expressions communicate a deeper level of meaning. Imagine you are talking about learning something new. A simple sentence might be, "I learned something today, and it was interesting." Let's expand that idea. You might say, "I learned something new today, and it was incredibly fascinating." Another option could be, "Today I discovered something new, and it was really enlightening." Or you might say, "Learning that today was a truly rewarding experience." Each expression shows a more advanced level of vocabulary. Another very useful skill is describing improvements and progress. See, when you're learning English, you often want to talk about how your skills are developing. Instead of saying, "My English is getting better," you could say, "My English is improving steadily." Another expression might be, "I feel that my English is progressing gradually." Or you could say, "I'm becoming more confident in my English communication." These expressions are commonly used when discussing personal growth. Let's practice a short speaking moment together. Imagine you are describing your English learning journey. You might say, "I have been practicing English every day, and I can see clear progress." Another sentence could be, "My vocabulary is expanding, little by little." Or you might say, "I'm gradually becoming more comfortable speaking English." These statements are useful for describing improvement and motivation. Another important aspect of vocabulary improvement involves describing challenges. Learning a language always includes moments that feel difficult. Instead of always using the word difficult, English offers many alternatives that help you describe the situation more precisely. For example, you might say something is challenging, complicated, or demanding. These words help you express difficulty with greater clarity. Imagine explaining a difficult task. Instead of saying, "The task was difficult," you could say, "The task was quite challenging." Another possibility might be, "The task required a lot of concentration." Or you could say, "The task was demanding, but very rewarding." These variations help your speech sound more natural and expressive. Let's practice one more reflection exercise before moving forward. Think about something challenging that you recently accomplished. Try describing it in English. You might say, "It was a challenging experience, but I learned a lot." Another possibility could be, "The process was demanding, but it helped me improve my skills." Or perhaps, "It was a complicated task, but completing it felt very satisfying." These sentences help you connect vocabulary with real-life experiences. As you continue expanding your vocabulary through situations like these, something very important begins to happen. You start to think less about individual words and more about ideas. Your brain begins to form complete expressions automatically. Instead of translating from your native language, you begin to express thoughts directly in English. This is one of the most important steps toward fluency. And remember, vocabulary improvement does not require memorizing thousands of words at once. Instead, it happens gradually through repeated exposure and practice. Every time you hear a word in context, every time you use it in a sentence, and every time you describe a real experience using that word, it becomes more familiar and easier to recall. So take a moment now and think about your day again. Try describing it using a few of the expressions we have practiced. So you might say, "Today was productive and rewarding," or "Today was demanding but satisfying," or perhaps, "Today was surprisingly relaxing." By practicing sentences like these regularly, you slowly build a vocabulary that allows you to communicate with clarity, confidence, and natural fluency. Let's continue expanding your vocabulary by exploring how English speakers describe everyday experiences in more detailed and expressive ways. One of the most useful habits you can develop while learning English is learning how to describe your surroundings and the situations you experience during the day. When you practice describing what you see, what you feel, and what you are doing, you naturally begin using a wider range of vocabulary. Imagine that you step outside in the morning and notice the weather. A very simple sentence could be, "The weather is nice today." That sentence is perfectly understandable, but English offers many ways to describe weather more vividly. Instead of saying nice, you might say, "The weather is pleasant today." You could also say, "The weather feels refreshing today." Or perhaps, "The weather is absolutely beautiful this morning." Each expression communicates the same idea, but adds more detail and emotion. Let's practice a small speaking moment together. Imagine you are talking to a friend about today's weather. You might say, "The weather today is calm and pleasant." Another possibility could be, "Today's weather feels incredibly refreshing." Or you might say, "The weather is so comfortable today that it makes the whole day feel better." These sentences show how vocabulary can create a clearer image for the listener. Another very common topic in everyday conversations is describing places. Whether you are talking about your home, a cafe, a park, or a city, vocabulary allows you to paint a picture with words. A beginner sentence might be something like, "This place is very good." But that sentence does not provide much information. Instead, you might say, "This place is very comfortable and welcoming." Or you could say, "This place has a really relaxing atmosphere." Another possibility might be, "This place feels peaceful and inviting." Imagine that you visit a quiet park in the evening. Instead of saying, "The park was good," you could say, "Geez, the park was very peaceful." Another expression might be, "The park had a calm and relaxing atmosphere." Or you might say, "The park felt incredibly refreshing after a long day." These types of descriptions help you sound more expressive and natural when speaking. Let's do another practice exercise. Imagine you are describing a cafe you visited recently. You might say, "The cafe had a very cozy atmosphere." Another possibility could be, "The cafe felt warm and welcoming." Or you might say, "No, the cafe had a really relaxing environment where people could sit and talk for hours." Practicing these kinds of descriptions helps you develop more detailed vocabulary. Vocabulary also becomes stronger when you learn to describe people in everyday conversations. When learners first begin speaking English, they often use simple descriptions like nice, good, or kind. While these words are useful, English provides many other words that describe personality more precisely. For example, instead of saying someone is nice, you might say they are friendly, thoughtful, or considerate. Imagine you are describing a colleague or classmate. Instead of saying, "She is very nice," you might say, "She is a very friendly person." Another expression could be, she is extremely thoughtful and helpful. Or you might say, she is very supportive and encouraging. These expressions help you describe people more clearly. Let's practice a small speaking moment together again. Imagine you are talking about a friend who always helps you. Instead of saying, "My friend is good," you might say, "My friend is very supportive." Another option could be, "My friend is incredibly reliable." Or you could say, "My friend is someone I can always depend on." These kinds of descriptions sound much more natural in real conversations. Another important skill in vocabulary development is describing activities. Many learners rely on very general verbs like do, make, or go. While these verbs are useful, English often uses more specific verbs to describe actions. For example, instead of saying do exercise, people often say work out. Instead of saying go shopping, people might say browse the shops or look around the stores. Imagine describing what you did yesterday evening. A simple sentence might be, "I did exercise yesterday." But you could make it more natural by saying, "I worked out yesterday evening." Another possibility might be, "I spent some time exercising yesterday evening." Or you could say, "I had a quick workout yesterday evening to relax after the day." These expressions sound smoother and more conversational. Let's practice again. Imagine someone asks you what you did during the weekend. You might say, "I spent the weekend relaxing and catching up on some reading." Another possibility could be, "I spent the weekend exploring the city and trying new food." Or you might say, "I used the weekend to rest and recharge." Each sentence communicates a clear image of how you spent your time. Another very powerful way to improve your vocabulary is learning how to describe thoughts and ideas. When people talk about their opinions or reflections, they often use descriptive vocabulary to explain their thinking. Instead of saying, "I think this idea is good," you might say, "I think this idea is very effective." Or you might say, "I believe this idea is very practical." Another expression could be, "In my opinion, this idea is extremely valuable." Imagine you are discussing learning English with someone. Instead of saying, "Learning English is good," you might say, "Learning English is extremely valuable." Another option could be, "Learning English opens many opportunities." Or you might say, "Learning English is an incredibly useful skill in today's world." These expressions make your ideas sound clearer and more confident. Let's practice another speaking moment together. Imagine someone asks you why you enjoy learning English. You might answer, "I enjoy learning English because it allows me to communicate with people from different countries." Another possibility could be, "I enjoy learning English because it helps me understand new cultures." Or you might say, "Learning English gives me access to new ideas and knowledge." Practicing answers like these helps you express your motivations more clearly. Vocabulary development also becomes easier when you learn how to describe improvement and change. In everyday life, we often talk about progress, development, and growth. Instead of saying, "Things are getting better," you might say, "Things are improving." Another expression could be, "Things are gradually becoming easier." Or you might say, "Things are progressing steadily." Imagine talking about your English learning progress. Instead of saying, "My English is getting better," you could say, "My English is improving steadily." Another option might be, "I can see gradual improvement in my English skills." Or you might say, I'm becoming more confident in speaking English. These expressions are commonly used by learners and professionals alike. Let's practice another small reflection exercise. Think about something you have improved recently. You might say, "My speaking skills are improving slowly but surely." Another possibility could be, "I feel more comfortable expressing my ideas in English." Or you might say, "I'm gradually expanding my vocabulary and becoming more confident." These sentences help you describe your learning journey. Another important category of vocabulary involves describing experiences and memories. People often talk about things they have done in the past, such as trips, conversations, or events. Instead of saying, "I had a good experience," you might say, "I had a wonderful experience." Another possibility could be, "It was a memorable experience." Or you might say, "It was an unforgettable moment." Imagine describing a trip you took recently. Instead of saying, "The trip was good," you might say, "The trip was absolutely amazing." Another option could be, "The trip was a truly memorable experience." Or you might say, "The trip was incredibly enjoyable and relaxing." These expressions allow you to communicate emotions more clearly. Let's do one more practice moment together. Imagine you are telling someone about a great day you had. You might say, "It was a wonderful day filled with interesting experiences." Another possibility could be, "It was a really memorable day that I will always remember." Or you might say, "It was one of the most enjoyable days I've had recently." Practicing these expressions helps your vocabulary become more expressive. As you continue practicing these kinds of sentences, you will notice that your vocabulary begins to grow naturally. Instead of thinking about individual words, you begin to think in complete expressions. This is exactly how fluent speakers communicate. They rely on patterns, experiences, and vocabulary combinations that they have used many times before. Remember that vocabulary improvement happens step by step. Each new word you learn becomes another tool that helps you communicate more clearly. When you practice describing your daily life, your experiences, your opinions, and your emotions, you gradually build a vocabulary that allows you to express yourself like a confident English speaker. Take a moment, hide now and think about your day again. Try describing it using richer vocabulary. You might say, "Today was productive and rewarding," or "Today felt calm and relaxing," or perhaps, "Today was challenging but extremely satisfying." By practicing sentences like these regularly, you will slowly transform your English into a powerful tool for communication. Let's continue strengthening your English vocabulary by focusing on how native speakers describe everyday situations in a more natural and expressive way. One of the biggest differences between basic English and advanced English is the ability to explain experiences clearly and smoothly. Many learners understand a large number of words, but they sometimes hesitate when they try to use them in real conversations. The goal of this lesson is to help you feel comfortable using vocabulary naturally when talking about your daily life. Think about a very common moment during the day, when someone asks you a simple question like, "How are you today?" Many learners answer with the same sentence every time, such as, "I am fine." Of course, this sentence is correct, but English offers many other ways to express how you feel. For example, you might say, "I'm doing quite well today." You could also say, "I'm feeling pretty good today." Another possibility might be, I'm doing really well. Thank you for asking. These expressions sound more natural and conversational. Now imagine that you are feeling a little tired after a long day. Instead of saying, I am tired, you might say, I'm a bit exhausted today. Another option could be, I feel slightly worn out after such a busy day. Or you might say, I'm feeling a little drained today. These expressions describe the same feeling, but add more detail and emotional meaning. Let's practice a small speaking moment together. Imagine someone asks you how you are feeling after finishing a long project. You might say, I feel relieved now that the project is finished. Another possibility could be, I feel very satisfied with the result. Or you might say, I feel proud of the effort I put into it. These sentences are useful because they describe both your action and your emotion. Another important part of vocabulary improvement involves describing your plans and intentions. In everyday conversations, people frequently talk about what they are going to do later in the day or during the week. A simple sentence might be, I will study later. That sentence is clear, but it can be expanded to sound more natural. You might say, I'm planning to study later this evening. Another option could be, I intend to spend some time studying later today. Or you might say, I'm hoping to review my notes later tonight. Let's imagine someone asks you about your weekend plans. Instead of saying, I will rest on the weekend, you might say, I'm planning to relax this weekend. Another expression could be, I'm looking forward to having a relaxing weekend. Or you might say, I plan to spend the weekend resting and catching up on a few things. These expressions make your speech sound more fluent and natural. Now let's practice again. Imagine a friend asks you what you will do tomorrow. You might answer, Tomorrow, I plan to focus on a few important tasks. Another response could be, Tomorrow, I'm going to spend some time learning something new. Or you might say, Tomorrow, I hope to have a productive and organized day. Practicing these types of sentences helps you express plans confidently. Another useful area of vocabulary is describing effort and determination. Many people talk about how hard they worked to achieve something. Instead of saying, I tried very hard, you might say, I put a lot of effort into it. Another possibility could be, I worked really hard to achieve that goal. Or you might say, I dedicated a lot of time and energy to completing that task. These expressions communicate determination more clearly. Imagine describing your experience learning English. Instead of saying, I practice English a lot, you could say, I dedicate time every day to practicing English. Another option might be, I consistently work on improving my English skills. Or you might say, I make a strong effort to practice English regularly. These sentences show commitment and motivation. Let's practice another reflection exercise together. Think about something you worked hard to accomplish recently. You might say, I worked very hard to complete that project successfully. Another possibility could be, I invested a lot of effort into learning that skill. Or you might say, I spent a lot of time practicing until I improved. These expressions are commonly used when describing personal achievements. Vocabulary improvement also becomes easier when you learn to describe situations that change over time. For example, say sometimes things begin slowly but later become successful. Instead of saying, it started bad but became good, you might say, it started slowly but eventually became successful. Another option could be, at first it was challenging, but it gradually became easier. Or you might say, the situation improved over time. Imagine describing your English learning journey. You might say, at the beginning, learning English felt difficult, but it gradually became easier. Another expression could be, at first I struggled, but over time I gained confidence. Or you might say, in the beginning it was challenging, but now I feel much more comfortable. These expressions describe progress clearly and naturally. Now let's explore vocabulary related to communication and conversations. In everyday life, people constantly talk with others, share ideas, and exchange opinions. Instead of always saying talk, English provides several verbs that describe communication more specifically. For example, you might say discuss, explain, share, or mention. Imagine that you had an interesting conversation with a friend. Instead of saying, we talked about many things, you might say, we discussed many interesting topics. Another option could be, we shared our thoughts about different ideas. Or you might say, we had a really engaging conversation about life and work. These expressions make your description more vivid. Let's practice again. Imagine you are telling someone about a conversation you had earlier today. You might say, earlier today I had a meaningful conversation with a colleague. Another possibility could be, I had a very interesting discussion with a friend. Or you might say, we shared several ideas and learned from each other. Practicing sentences like these helps you develop natural conversational vocabulary. Another important group of vocabulary involves describing learning and understanding. When you learn something new, you might say you understood, realized, or discovered something. For example, instead of saying, I learned something today, you might say, I discovered something new today. Another possibility could be, I realized something important today. Or you might say, I gained a deeper understanding of that topic. Imagine describing a moment when you understood something clearly. You might say, today I realized how important practice is when learning English. Another option could be, so I discovered a new way to remember vocabulary. Or you might say, I gained a clearer understanding of how to use certain expressions. These expressions sound thoughtful and natural. Let's practice a small reflection moment. Think about something new you learned recently. You might say, I discovered a useful learning technique today. Another possibility could be, I realized that consistent practice makes a big difference. Or, you might say, I learned something today that will help me improve faster. These sentences help you connect vocabulary with learning experiences. Another useful area of vocabulary is describing motivation and inspiration. When people feel motivated, they often use words that express energy and enthusiasm. Instead of saying, I want to improve, you might say, I'm determined to improve. Another expression could be, I'm motivated to keep learning. Or you might say, I feel inspired to continue practicing. Imagine talking about your English learning goals. You might say, I'm determined to become fluent in English. Another possibility could be, I feel motivated to practice English every day. Or you might say, I'm inspired to continue learning and improving. These expressions show strong motivation. Let's practice again together. Imagine you are encouraging yourself after a difficult lesson. You might say, I will keep practicing until I improve. Another option could be, I'm determined to overcome these challenges. Or you might say, I'm motivated to continue learning, no matter how difficult it feels. These sentences are powerful because they connect vocabulary with determination. As you continue practicing these types of expressions, your vocabulary gradually becomes more flexible and natural. Instead of relying on the same simple words repeatedly, you begin to use a variety of expressions that describe ideas more precisely. This is exactly how advanced speakers communicate in everyday situations. Remember that fluency does not come from knowing thousands of words instantly. It comes from understanding how to use words naturally in real conversations. Each time you practice describing your experiences, sharing your thoughts, or explaining your plans, you strengthen your ability to communicate clearly. So take a moment now and reflect on your day once again. Try describing it using richer vocabulary. You might say, today was productive and fulfilling, or today was demanding but rewarding, or perhaps today was calm and refreshing. These small changes in vocabulary make your English sound more expressive and confident. Let's continue developing your vocabulary by exploring how English speakers describe situations, emotions, and experiences in a more precise and expressive way. One of the most noticeable differences between basic English and advanced English is the ability to describe situations clearly without repeating the same simple words again and again. When learners reach a higher level of fluency, they begin to naturally replace very common words with expressions that communicate deeper meaning. Think about a very common sentence that people say when they talk about their day. Many learners say something like, "Today was very busy." That sentence is completely correct and useful. However, native speakers often use several other expressions to describe the same experience. For example, someone might say, "Today was extremely hectic." Another person might say, "Today was incredibly demanding." Or they might say, "Today was packed with responsibilities." These expressions create a stronger and more vivid description of the day. Now imagine explaining your schedule to a friend. Instead of saying, "I had many things to do today," you might say, "I had a lot on my schedule today." Another possibility could be, "I had several important tasks to handle today." Or you might say, "My day was filled with different responsibilities." These expressions sound very natural and are frequently used in everyday conversations. Let's practice a short speaking moment together. Imagine someone asks you, "Why were you so busy today?" You might say, "I had several tasks that required my full attention." Another response could be, "I had a lot of responsibilities to take care of today." Or you might say, "My schedule was completely full today." These responses help you sound more confident and natural when speaking. Another very useful vocabulary skill involves describing how something feels or appears. Instead of always using the word very, English offers many descriptive adjectives that make sentences more powerful. For example, instead of saying very big, you might say enormous. Instead of saying very small, you might say tiny. Instead of saying very interesting, you might say fascinating. Imagine describing a city that you visited recently. A beginner sentence might be, "The city was very big." But you could improve the sentence by saying, the city was enormous. Another option could be, the city was incredibly large and lively. Or you might say, the city felt massive and full of energy. These expressions help you communicate a clearer picture of the place. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine you visited a beautiful place during a trip. Instead of saying, the place was very beautiful, you might say, the place was absolutely stunning. Another possibility could be, the place was breathtaking. Or you might say, the place was incredibly beautiful and peaceful. Practicing these expressions helps your vocabulary grow naturally. Another important part of vocabulary development involves describing feelings and reactions. In everyday conversations, people frequently talk about how something made them feel. Instead of always saying, I liked it, English offers many other expressions. For example, you might say, I really enjoyed it. Another expression could be, I found it extremely enjoyable. Or you might say, I truly appreciated the experience. Imagine describing a book you recently read. Instead of saying, I liked the book, you might say, I really enjoyed the book. Another option could be, I found the book incredibly engaging. Or you might say, the book was so captivating that I couldn't stop reading. These expressions make your speech sound more vivid and interesting. Let's practice again. Imagine someone asks you about a movie you watched recently. You might say, the movie was incredibly entertaining. Another possibility could be, the movie was absolutely fascinating. Or you might say, the movie kept my attention from beginning to end. Practicing sentences like these helps you communicate your reactions more clearly. Another area where vocabulary becomes very important is describing improvement and learning. When people talk about their progress in learning something new, they often use words that describe growth. Instead of saying, I learned a lot, you might say, I gained a lot of knowledge. Another possibility could be, I developed new skills. Or you might say, I improved my understanding of the subject. Imagine describing your English learning progress to a friend. Instead of saying, I learned many things, you might say, I gained a lot of useful knowledge. Another option could be, I improved my vocabulary significantly. Or you might say, I developed stronger communication skills. These expressions sound more confident and professional. Let's practice another reflection moment together. Think about something you learned recently. You might say, I gained a deeper understanding of that topic. Another possibility could be, I developed a new perspective on that idea. Or you might say, I improved my ability to explain things clearly. These expressions are very useful in both casual and professional conversations. Another key vocabulary skill is describing opinions politely and clearly. In English conversations, people often soften their opinions by using certain expressions. Instead of saying, this is wrong, someone might say, I'm not sure that's correct. Instead of saying, that idea is bad, they might say, I don't think that idea would work very well. These expressions help conversations sound respectful and natural. Imagine discussing an idea with a colleague or friend. Instead of saying, your idea is wrong, you might say, I am not completely convinced by that idea. Another option could be, I see your point, but I have a slightly different opinion. Or you might say, that's an interesting idea, but I think we might need another approach. These expressions are extremely common in natural English conversations. Let's practice another speaking exercise. Imagine you are sharing your opinion about a topic. You might say, in my opinion, this approach could be very effective. Another possibility could be, from my perspective, this solution seems practical. Or you might say, personally, I believe this idea has a lot of potential. These expressions help you share ideas confidently. Vocabulary improvement also becomes stronger when you learn how to describe possibilities and future opportunities. In everyday conversations, people often talk about what might happen or what they hope will happen. Instead of saying, maybe it will happen, you might say, there is a good chance it will happen. Another expression could be, it's quite possible that it will happen. Or you might say, there is a strong possibility that it will happen. Imagine discussing your future plans. Instead of saying, maybe I will travel next year, you might say, there is a good chance I will travel next year. Another option could be, I'm hoping to travel next year. Or you might say, I'm planning to explore new places next year. These expressions help you sound more confident when talking about future possibilities. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine someone asks you about your goals. You might say, I hope to improve my English even more in the future. Another possibility could be, I'm planning to continue developing my communication skills. Or you might say, I'm determined to reach a higher level of fluency. These sentences clearly express your goals. Another important vocabulary category involves describing challenges and obstacles. Life often includes difficult situations, and English speakers frequently use specific vocabulary to describe these moments. Instead of saying, this problem is very big, you might say, this problem is quite serious. Another option could be, this challenge requires careful thinking. Or you might say, this situation is complicated, but manageable. Imagine describing a challenge you faced recently. Instead of saying, the problem was hard, you might say, the problem was quite challenging. Another possibility could be, the situation required patience and effort. Or you might say, it was a complicated situation, but I managed to handle it. These expressions help you sound calm and confident when describing difficulties. Let's practice one more reflection moment. Think about a challenge you overcame recently. You might say, it was a difficult challenge, but I managed to solve it. Another possibility could be, the situation was complicated, but I found a solution. Or you might say, the experience was demanding, but it helped me grow. These expressions help you communicate resilience and determination. As you continue practicing vocabulary through these real-life situations, you will notice that your English begins to feel more natural and flexible. Instead of translating ideas word by word, you begin expressing thoughts using complete phrases and expressions. This is exactly how fluent speakers communicate. Remember that building vocabulary is like building a strong foundation. Every new word adds another piece to your ability to communicate clearly. The more you practice describing your daily life, sharing your opinions, and reflecting on your experiences. The stronger your English will become. Take a moment now and think about your day again. Try describing it with more expressive vocabulary. You might say, "Today was demanding, but rewarding." Or, "Today was busy, yet productive." Or perhaps, "Today was calm and surprisingly enjoyable." Practicing these kinds of sentences every day will gradually transform your English into a confident and natural form of communication. Let's continue expanding your vocabulary by focusing on how people describe everyday situations in a more natural and expressive way during real conversations. One of the most useful skills you can develop in English is the ability to explain what is happening around you with clarity and confidence. When you learn vocabulary through real situations instead of isolated word lists, your brain begins to connect words with real experiences. And that is when your speaking ability starts improving more rapidly. Think about a simple situation where someone asks you about your day at work or school. A beginner might say, "Today was difficult." This sentence communicates the idea, but it does not explain the experience very clearly. Instead, you could say, "Today was quite challenging." Another possibility could be, "Today required a lot of concentration." Or you might say, "Today was demanding. See, but I managed to complete everything." These sentences describe the situation more clearly and show how vocabulary helps you communicate your experience. Now imagine describing a productive day. Instead of saying, "Today was good," you might say, "Today was very productive." Another option could be, "Today was extremely rewarding." Or you could say, "Today felt very satisfying because I accomplished several important tasks." These expressions are very common in everyday English and help your speech sound more natural. Let's practice a short speaking moment together. Imagine someone asks you this question, "How did your day go?" You might respond by saying, "My day went quite well. I managed to complete several tasks." Another response could be, "My day was productive and I learned a few new things." Or you might say, "It was a busy day, but it was also very rewarding." Practicing these responses helps you develop more flexible vocabulary. Another very useful area of vocabulary is describing improvements and results. Many conversations involve talking about progress. Instead of saying, "I got better," you might say, "I improved significantly." Another possibility could be, "I made noticeable progress." Or you might say, "I managed to improve my performance." These expressions sound more confident and natural. Imagine talking about your English learning journey. Instead of saying, "My English is better now," you could say, "My English has improved a lot recently." Another expression could be, "I've made steady progress in my English skills." Or you might say, "I'm becoming much more comfortable speaking English." These sentences clearly communicate growth and improvement. Let's practice another reflection exercise. Think about something you improved recently. You might say, "I've made real progress in my vocabulary." Another possibility could be, "I've improved my ability to express my ideas." Or you might say, "My confidence in speaking English has grown." These expressions help you communicate personal development clearly. Another important vocabulary skill involves describing situations that happen unexpectedly. Life often surprises us, and English has many expressions that describe surprise. Instead of saying, "I was very surprised," you might say, I was amazed. Another option could be, I was completely astonished. Or you might say, I was pleasantly surprised. Each expression shows a slightly different level of surprise. Imagine that you receive good news unexpectedly. Instead of saying, I was very surprised, you might say, I was genuinely amazed by the news. Another possibility could be, I was pleasantly surprised when I heard the news. Or you might say, the news completely caught me off guard. These expressions make your reaction sound more vivid. Let's practice again. Imagine that something positive happened during your day. You might say, I was pleasantly surprised by how well things went. Another possibility could be, I was amazed by the result. Or you might say, it was completely unexpected, but it turned out really well. Practicing sentences like these helps your vocabulary become more expressive. Another very useful group of vocabulary involves describing experiences that were enjoyable. Instead of always saying, it was fun, English speakers often use more descriptive words. For example, you might say, it was enjoyable, it was entertaining, or it was delightful. Each of these words describes enjoyment, but adds a slightly different feeling. Imagine describing a relaxing evening. Instead of saying, the evening was fun, you might say, the evening was very enjoyable. Another possibility could be, the evening was incredibly relaxing. Or you might say, the evening was delightful and peaceful. These expressions create a more vivid image of the experience. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine you spent time with friends recently. You might say, I had a really enjoyable time with my friends. Another possibility could be, the evening was very entertaining. Or you might say, we had a wonderful time talking and laughing together. These expressions sound warm and natural in conversation. Another important vocabulary area involves describing effort and achievement. When people complete something important, they often use expressions that show pride and satisfaction. Instead of saying, I finished it, you might say, I successfully completed it. Another possibility could be, I managed to finish it, or you might say, I finally accomplished it. Imagine describing a task you worked on for several days. Instead of saying, I finished the task, you might say, I finally completed the task successfully. Another option could be, I managed to finish the project after a lot of effort. Or you might say, I accomplished something important today. These expressions clearly communicate effort and achievement. Let's practice a short reflection moment again. Think about something you accomplished recently. You might say, I successfully completed an important task today. Another possibility could be, I finally achieved one of my goals. Or you might say, I managed to finish something that required a lot of effort. These sentences help you communicate achievements confidently. Another important category of vocabulary involves describing ideas and thoughts. When people discuss ideas, they often use words like effective, practical, and useful. Instead of saying, this idea is good, you might say, this idea is very effective. Another possibility could be, this idea is extremely practical. Or you might say, this idea could be very useful. Imagine discussing a learning method. Instead of saying, this method is good, you might say, this method is very effective. Another option could be, this approach is extremely practical. Or you might say, this method works really well for learning. These expressions are common in discussions about strategies and solutions. Let's practice again. Imagine you are explaining a study method to a friend. You might say, "This technique is very useful for remembering vocabulary." Another possibility could be, "This strategy works very well for improving speaking skills." Or you might say, "This approach can help learners progress faster." These sentences clearly communicate useful ideas. Another helpful group of vocabulary involves describing confidence and certainty. Instead of saying, "I know," English speakers sometimes say, "I'm certain," "I'm confident," or "I'm sure." These expressions communicate strong belief in something. Imagine describing your belief about learning English. Instead of saying, "I know practice helps," you might say, "I'm confident that practice helps." Another possibility could be, "I'm certain that consistent practice leads to improvement." Or you might say, "I'm sure that dedication makes a difference." These expressions sound very natural and motivating. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine encouraging yourself while learning English. You might say, "I'm confident that my English will improve." Another possibility could be, "I'm sure that practice will help me succeed." Or you might say, "I'm certain that persistence will lead to progress." These sentences help you express determination. Another useful skill is describing possibilities and opportunities. When people talk about the future, they often use expressions that show hope and potential. Instead of saying, "Maybe it will happen," you might say, "There is a strong possibility." Another expression could be, "There is a good chance." Or you might say, "It is very likely." Imagine describing an opportunity to travel. Instead of saying, "Maybe I will travel next year," you might say, "There is a good chance I will travel next year." Another option could be, "It is very likely that I will travel next year." Or you might say, "I'm hoping to travel next year." These expressions make your speech sound more confident. Let's practice one more reflection exercise. Think about a goal you have for the future. You might say, "There is a strong possibility that I will reach my goal." Another possibility could be, "I'm confident that I will achieve my goal." Or you might say, "I'm determined to continue improving." These sentences help you express optimism and ambition. As you continue practicing these vocabulary patterns, you will notice that your English begins to feel more flexible and natural. Instead of repeating the same simple words again and again, you begin to choose expressions that communicate your thoughts more clearly. This is one of the key steps towards sounding like a confident English speaker. Always remember that vocabulary grows through practice and repetition. The more you describe your daily experiences, your emotions, and your ideas in English, the stronger your vocabulary becomes. Every sentence you practice helps train your brain to use English more naturally. Take a moment now to describe your day once again using richer vocabulary. You might say, "Today was productive and satisfying." Or you might say, "Today was challenging but rewarding." Or perhaps, "Today was calm and enjoyable." By practicing these kinds of sentences regularly, you gradually build the confidence and vocabulary needed to communicate fluently in English. Let's continue building your vocabulary by focusing on how people describe everyday conversations and interactions. Communication is one of the most important parts of daily life, and learning how to express yourself clearly during conversations will significantly improve your English fluency. Many learners understand what others say, but they sometimes struggle to respond naturally. This usually happens because they rely on a very small group of familiar words. When you expand your vocabulary, responding in conversations becomes much easier and more comfortable. Imagine that you meet a friend after a long time, and they ask you how things have been recently. A simple answer might be, "So things have been good." That sentence is perfectly understandable, but you can make it more expressive. For example, you might say, "Things have been going really well lately." Another option could be, "Everything has been going quite smoothly recently." Or you might say, "Things have been pretty positive lately." Each response sounds natural and communicates a slightly different tone. Now, imagine the opposite situation, where things have been a bit difficult. Instead of saying, "Things were bad," you might say, "Things have been a little challenging lately." Another possibility could be, "It's been a bit of a difficult period recently." Or you might say, "I've had a few challenges recently, but things are improving." These expressions sound calm and natural when discussing difficulties. Let's practice a small speaking moment together. Imagine someone asks you how your week has been. You might say, "My week has been quite productive." Another possibility could be, "It's been a busy but rewarding week." Or you might say, "My week has been challenging, but I've learned a lot." Practicing these types of responses helps you speak more confidently in everyday conversations. Another important area of vocabulary is describing communication itself. When people talk about conversations, they often use different verbs instead of always using the word talk. For example, they might say chat, discuss, explain, or share. These verbs describe different types of conversations and interactions. Imagine describing a friendly conversation you had with someone. Instead of saying, "We talked for a long time," you might say, "We chatted for a long time." Another option could be, "We had a really interesting discussion." Or you might say, "We shared our ideas and experiences." These expressions sound very natural and are commonly used in daily life. Let's practice again. Imagine you are describing a conversation with a colleague. You might say, "Earlier today, I had a productive discussion with a colleague." Another possibility could be, "I had a meaningful conversation with a friend." Or you might say, "We spent some time exchanging ideas." These sentences clearly describe communication and interaction. Another important vocabulary skill is describing situations where you agree or disagree with someone. In everyday conversations, people often share opinions and respond politely to other ideas. Instead of saying, "You are wrong," English speakers often use softer expressions. For example, they might say, "I'm not sure I agree." Another option could be, "I see your point, but I have a different perspective." Or they might say, "That's an interesting idea, but I think there might be another solution." Imagine discussing a plan with a group of people. Instead of saying, "Your plan is wrong," you might say, "I'm not sure this plan will work." Another possibility could be, "I understand your idea, but I think we should consider another option." Or you might say, "That's a good suggestion, but we might need to adjust it slightly." These expressions make conversations more respectful and cooperative. Let's practice a short speaking exercise. Imagine someone shares an idea with you. You might respond by saying, "That's a very interesting idea." Another possibility could be, "I see what you mean." Or you might say, "That's an excellent suggestion." These responses help keep conversations positive and engaging. Another useful category of vocabulary involves describing how you feel during conversations. Sometimes conversations are enjoyable and stimulating, while other times they may feel stressful or uncomfortable. Instead of saying, "The conversation was good," you might say, "The conversation was engaging." Another option could be, "The conversation was inspiring." Or you might say, "The conversation was very informative." Imagine describing a conversation that helped you learn something new. Instead of saying, "The talk was good," you might say, "The conversation was incredibly insightful." Another possibility could be, "The discussion was very informative." Or you might say, "The conversation gave me a new perspective." These expressions help you sound thoughtful and articulate. Let's practice again. Imagine you attended a meeting or discussion. You might say, "The meeting was very productive." Another possibility could be, "The discussion was extremely valuable." Or you might say, "The conversation helped clarify several important points." These sentences are commonly used in professional environments as well. Another key area of vocabulary is describing curiosity and interest. When people are curious about something, they often ask questions and explore new ideas. Instead of saying, "I want to know more," you might say, "I'm curious to learn more." Another option could be, "I'm interested in discovering more about that." Or you might say, "I'd like to understand that better." Imagine someone tells you about an interesting topic. Instead of saying, "Tell me more," you might say, "I'd love to learn more about that." Another possibility could be, "That sounds fascinating. I'm curious to know more." Or you might say, "That's really interesting. Could you explain it further?" These expressions make conversations feel more engaging. Let's practice a small reflection moment. Imagine you hear about a new idea or project. You might say, "That sounds really interesting." Another possibility could be, "I'm curious to learn more about that idea." Or you might say, "I'd love to understand how that works." These expressions help you participate actively in conversations. Another useful vocabulary group involves describing confidence and uncertainty. Sometimes you feel sure about something, and sometimes you're not completely certain. Instead of saying maybe, you might say it's possible. Another expression could be, "I'm not entirely sure." Or you might say, "There's a chance." Imagine discussing a future plan with a friend. Instead of saying, "Maybe we will meet tomorrow," you might say, "It's possible that we'll meet tomorrow." Another possibility could be, "There's a chance we'll meet tomorrow." Or you might say, "I'm not completely sure yet, but we might meet tomorrow." These expressions sound more natural in conversations. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine someone asks you if you will attend an event. You might say, "I'm not entirely sure yet." Another possibility could be, "There's a good chance I will attend." Or you might say, "I'm still deciding, but I might come." These responses sound polite and natural. Another important vocabulary skill involves describing appreciation and gratitude. In everyday conversations, people often express thanks and appreciation. Instead of simply saying, "Thank you," you might say, "I really appreciate it." Another possibility could be, "I'm very grateful for your help." Or you might say, "That means a lot to me." Imagine someone helps you solve a problem. Instead of saying, "Thanks," you might say, "I really appreciate your help." Another option could be, "Thank you so much for your support." Or you might say, "I'm truly grateful for your assistance." These expressions show genuine appreciation. Let's practice again. Imagine someone gives you useful advice. You might say, "Thank you for the advice. I really appreciate it." Another possibility could be, "That's very helpful. Thank you." Or you might say, "I'm grateful for your suggestion." These sentences sound warm and sincere. Another helpful group of vocabulary involves describing encouragement and support. When people motivate others, they often use positive and encouraging language. Instead of saying, "You can do it," you might say, "I believe in you." Another option could be, "I'm confident you'll succeed." Or you might say, "Or keep going. You're doing great." Imagine encouraging a friend who is learning something new. Instead of saying, "Try harder," you might say, "Keep practicing and you'll improve." Another possibility could be, "You're making great progress." Or you might say, "Don't give up. You're getting better every day." These expressions sound supportive and motivating. Let's practice one more reflection exercise. Imagine encouraging yourself while learning English. You might say, "I'm improving step by step." Another possibility could be, "My English is getting stronger every day." Or you might say, "I'm confident that I will become fluent." These sentences help you maintain motivation and positivity. As you continue practicing these vocabulary patterns, you will begin to notice that conversations feel easier and more natural. Instead of searching for words, your brain will start recognizing familiar expressions that you have practiced many times. This is exactly how fluent speakers communicate. Remember that vocabulary improvement happens gradually. Each new word and expression you learn adds another layer to your communication skills. The more you practice describing your experiences, sharing your opinions, and responding in conversations, the more confident your English will become. Take a moment now and reflect on what you learned in this lesson. Try describing your learning experience using richer vocabulary. You might say, "This lesson was very informative." Or you might say, "This lesson helped me expand my vocabulary." Or perhaps, "This lesson gave me new confidence in speaking English." Practicing these sentences helps you strengthen your vocabulary and develop fluent communication skills. Let's continue strengthening your vocabulary by focusing on how English speakers describe situations in more detail. When they tell stories about their daily life, storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to practice vocabulary because it allows you to combine actions, emotions, and descriptions into a natural flow of language. When you learn to tell simple stories in English, your vocabulary becomes more flexible and your speaking becomes more fluent. Think about a simple situation where someone asks you what happened during your day. A beginner might say something like, "I went to the store and bought food." That sentence is correct, but it can easily become more expressive. Instead, you might say, "Earlier today, I went to the store to buy some groceries." Another option could be, "I stopped by the store earlier to pick up a few things." Or you might say, "I visited a nearby store to buy some groceries for the evening." These sentences communicate the same action, but with richer vocabulary. Now imagine describing what happened after you arrived at the store. Instead of saying, "The store was very full," you might say, "The store was quite crowded." Another possibility could be, "The store was extremely busy." Or you might say, "The store was packed with people." These expressions help create a clearer image of the environment. Let's practice a short storytelling exercise together. Imagine you are explaining what you did yesterday afternoon. You might say, "Yesterday afternoon, I decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood." Another possibility could be, "Yesterday afternoon, I went out for a relaxing walk." Or you might say, "I spent some time walking around the neighborhood to clear my mind." Practicing storytelling like this helps you combine vocabulary naturally. Another important part of storytelling is describing how situations change over time. In everyday life, events rarely stay the same. Something might start slowly and later become exciting or challenging. English speakers often use words like suddenly, gradually, or eventually to describe these changes. Imagine describing a moment when something unexpected happened. Instead of saying, "something happened," you might say, "suddenly, something unexpected happened." Another possibility could be, "out of nowhere, something surprising occurred." Or you might say, "eventually, the situation changed." These words help the listener understand how events developed. Let's practice again. Imagine you are telling a story about a problem you solved. You might say, "At first, the problem seemed difficult." Another possibility could be, "In the beginning, the situation was confusing." Or you might say, "Eventually, I found a solution." These expressions help you describe the timeline of events. Another key vocabulary skill involves describing reactions and emotions during experiences. When people tell stories, they often explain how they felt in that moment. Instead of saying, "I was very happy," you might say, "I felt incredibly excited." Another possibility could be, "I felt extremely relieved." Or you might say, "I felt truly satisfied." Imagine describing the moment when you completed an important task. Instead of saying, "I was happy when I finished," you might say, "I felt relieved when I finally finished." Another option could be, "I felt proud of what I had accomplished." Or you might say, "I felt incredibly satisfied with the result." These expressions help listeners understand your emotions more clearly. Let's practice a small reflection moment. Think about something positive that happened recently. You might say, "I felt really proud when I completed the task." Another possibility could be, "I felt incredibly happy about the result." Or you might say, "I felt relieved when everything worked out." These expressions help you describe emotional reactions naturally. Another useful vocabulary group involves describing effort and persistence. Many stories involve moments where people work hard to achieve something. Instead of saying, "I tried again," you might say, "I made another attempt." Another possibility could be, "I kept trying until I succeeded." Or you might say, "I refused to give up." Imagine describing a challenge you faced while learning something new. Instead of saying, "It was hard," you might say, "It required a lot of effort." Another option could be, "It took patience and persistence." Or you might say, "I had to work hard to overcome the challenge." These expressions clearly describe determination. Let's practice again. Imagine you are describing your effort to improve your English. You might say, "I practice English every day to improve my skills." Another possibility could be, "I put a lot of effort into learning new vocabulary." Or you might say, "I stay consistent with my practice." These sentences communicate dedication and persistence. Another important area of vocabulary involves describing lessons learned from experiences. When people tell stories, they often explain what they learned from the situation. Instead of saying, "I learned something," you might say, "I gained valuable experience." Another possibility could be, "I learned an important lesson." Or you might say, "The experience taught me something useful." Imagine describing a situation where you made a mistake but learned from it. Instead of saying, "I made a mistake," you might say, "I realized my mistake." Another possibility could be, "I learned from that experience." Or you might say, "The experience helped me grow." These expressions sound thoughtful and mature. Let's practice another reflection moment together. Think about something you learned recently. You might say, "I learned a valuable lesson from that situation." Another possibility could be, "That experience helped me improve." Or you might say, "It taught me how to handle similar situations better." These expressions are very useful in both personal and professional conversations. Another powerful vocabulary skill involves describing motivation and determination. Many successful people talk about how they stayed motivated during difficult times. Instead of saying, "I wanted to succeed," you might say, "I was determined to succeed." Another possibility could be, "I stayed motivated to keep going." Or you might say, "I remained focused on my goal." Imagine describing your motivation for learning English. Instead of saying, "I want to speak English well," you might say, "I'm determined to become fluent in English." Another option could be, "I'm motivated to improve my communication skills." Or you might say, "I'm committed to learning English every day." These expressions show strong determination. Let's practice again. Imagine encouraging yourself during your learning journey. You might say, "I'm determined to keep improving." Another possibility could be, "I'm motivated to reach my goals." Or you might say, "I will continue practicing until I succeed." These sentences help reinforce motivation and confidence. Another helpful group of vocabulary involves describing opportunities and possibilities. When people talk about the future, they often use expressions that show hope and potential. Instead of saying, "Maybe something good will happen," you might say, "There is a strong possibility that something good will happen." Another possibility could be, "There is a good chance things will improve." Or you might say, "Zhao, the future looks promising." Imagine describing your future plans. Instead of saying, "Maybe I will improve my English," you might say, "I'm confident that my English will improve." Another possibility could be, "There is a strong chance I will become fluent." Or you might say, "I'm optimistic about my progress." These expressions communicate confidence and positivity. Let's practice one more reflection exercise. Think about a goal you want to achieve. You might say, "I'm confident that I will reach my goal." Another possibility could be, "I'm optimistic about my future progress." Or you might say, "Sat, I'm determined to keep improving." These expressions help you express ambition clearly. As you continue practicing storytelling and description like this, your vocabulary becomes more dynamic and expressive. Instead of using very basic words repeatedly, you begin choosing words that describe situations more precisely. This is one of the key steps in sounding like a natural English speaker. Remember that fluency comes from combining vocabulary, practice, and real-life communication. The more you describe your experiences, tell stories, and reflect on your learning journey, the more natural your English will become. Take a moment now and think about a small story from your day. Try describing it in English using richer vocabulary. You might say, earlier today, I had a very productive moment when I solved a difficult problem. Or you might say, today I learned something valuable that will help me improve. Or perhaps, today was challenging but extremely rewarding. Practicing storytelling like this strengthens both your vocabulary and your confidence. Let's continue expanding your vocabulary by focusing on how English speakers describe thoughts, reflections, and personal experiences in a deeper and more natural way. When conversations move beyond simple facts and begin to include reflections as opinions, vocabulary becomes even more important. This is the stage where many learners move from intermediate communication toward advanced fluency. Instead of simply describing what happened, you begin explaining what you think about it and what it means to you. Think about a very common moment when someone asks you about an experience you had recently. A beginner might say something like, "It was very good." While that sentence is correct, it does not communicate much detail. Instead, you might say, "It was a really rewarding experience." Another option could be, "It was an incredibly meaningful experience." Or you might say, "It was a very memorable experience." These expressions help you describe not just the event, but the emotional impact of the event. Imagine you recently attended a meeting, a class, or a discussion where you learned something new. Instead of saying, "The meeting was good," you might say, "The meeting was very informative." Another possibility could be, "The meeting was extremely productive." Or you might say, "The meeting gave me valuable insights." These expressions help your speech sound thoughtful and natural. Let's practice a short reflection moment together. Imagine someone asks you about something you learned today. You might say, "Today I learned something very useful." Another possibility could be, "Today I gained a deeper understanding of something important." Or you might say, "Today's experience helped me see things from a new perspective." Practicing sentences like these helps you communicate your thoughts more clearly. Another important part of advanced vocabulary involves describing personal growth. Many conversations involve talking about how people improve over time. Instead of saying, "I changed a lot," you might say, "I've grown a lot." Another possibility could be, "I've developed new skills." Or you might say, "I've become more confident." These expressions help you describe personal development. Imagine explaining how your English has improved over time. Instead of saying, "My English is better now," you might say, "My English has improved significantly." Another option could be, "I've developed stronger communication skills." Or you might say, "I've become much more confident speaking English." These expressions sound natural and positive. Let's practice again. Imagine someone asks how your learning journey has been going. You might say, "I've made steady progress in my English." Another possibility could be, "My confidence in speaking has increased." Or you might say, "I feel much more comfortable expressing my ideas now." These responses clearly describe improvement. Another important vocabulary area involves describing decisions and choices. In everyday life, people constantly talk about the decisions they make. Instead of saying, I decided to do it. You might say, I made the decision to do it. Another possibility could be, I chose to do it. Or you might say, I felt it was the right decision. Imagine explaining why you started learning English. Instead of saying, I decided to learn English, you might say, I made the decision to start learning English. Another option could be, I chose to learn English because it opens many opportunities. Or you might say, I felt that learning English would help my future. These expressions sound thoughtful and natural. Let's practice another speaking moment. Imagine someone asks why you started practicing English every day. You might say, I decided to practice every day to improve faster. Another possibility could be, I made a commitment to practice English regularly. Or you might say, I chose to focus on improving my communication skills. These expressions clearly explain motivation. Another powerful vocabulary skill involves describing perspectives and viewpoints. When people share their opinions, they often use expressions that show their perspective. Instead of saying, I think, you might say, from my perspective. Another option could be, in my view, or you might say, as far as I'm concerned. Imagine discussing the importance of learning languages. Instead of saying, I think learning languages is important, you might say, from my perspective, learning languages is extremely valuable. Another option could be, in my view, learning languages opens many doors. Or you might say, as far as I'm concerned, language learning is a powerful skill. These expressions make your speech sound more confident and advanced. Let's practice another reflection exercise. Imagine sharing your thoughts about learning English. You might say, from my perspective, learning English creates many opportunities. Another possibility could be, in my view, language learning helps people connect with others. Or you might say, as far as I'm concerned, communication skills are essential. These sentences help you express opinions clearly. Another important group of vocabulary involves describing challenges and overcoming difficulties. Life often presents obstacles, and English speakers frequently use descriptive language when talking about these experiences. Instead of saying, it was very hard, you might say, it was extremely challenging. Another possibility could be, it required a lot of effort, or you might say, it pushed me out of my comfort zone. Imagine describing a difficult learning experience. Instead of saying, learning was hard, you might say, learning was challenging but rewarding. Another option could be, it required patience and determination. Or you might say, it pushed me to improve. These expressions help you describe growth through difficulty. Let's practice another moment together. Imagine describing a challenge you overcame. You might say, it was a difficult challenge, but I managed to overcome it. Another possibility could be, the experience required persistence. Or you might say, it helped me become stronger and more confident. These sentences communicate resilience. Another useful vocabulary skill involves describing encouragement and inspiration. When people talk about motivation, they often use positive expressions. Instead of saying, keep trying, you might say, don't give up. Another option could be, keep pushing forward, or you might say, stay focused on your goals. Imagine encouraging someone who is, learning English. Instead of saying, try again, you might say, keep practicing and you'll improve. Another possibility could be, don't give up. Progress takes time. Or you might say, stay consistent and you'll see results. These expressions are encouraging and motivating. Let's practice again. Imagine encouraging yourself during your learning journey. You might say, I will keep practicing until I improve. Another possibility could be, I'm determined to reach my goal. Or you might say, I'm confident that I will succeed. These sentences help reinforce motivation. Another important vocabulary group involves describing gratitude and appreciation. When people recognize the help or support of others, they often express appreciation in different ways. Instead of saying, thank you, you might say, I really appreciate it. Another possibility could be, I'm very grateful. Or you might say, that means a lot to me. Imagine someone helps you understand something difficult. Instead of saying, thanks, you might say, I really appreciate your help. Another option could be, I'm grateful for your support. Or you might say, your help means a lot to me. These expressions sound warm and sincere. Let's practice another moment. Imagine someone gives you useful advice. You might say, thank you for the advice. I appreciate it. Another possibility could be, that was very helpful. Thank you. Or you might say, I'm grateful for your suggestion. These responses sound polite and genuine. Another important vocabulary area involves describing optimism and future possibilities. People often talk about what they hope will happen in the future. Instead of saying, maybe things will improve, you might say, things will likely improve. Another possibility could be, there is strong potential for improvement. Or you might say, the future looks promising. Imagine describing your future goals with English. Instead of saying, maybe I will become fluent, you might say, I'm confident that I will become fluent. Another option could be, I believe I will reach a high level of fluency. Or you might say, I'm optimistic about my progress. These expressions show confidence and determination. Let's practice one more reflection exercise together. Think about your future goals. You might say, I'm confident that I will achieve my goals. Another possibility could be, I'm optimistic about my learning journey. Or you might say, I believe that dedication will lead to success. These sentences express her hope and ambition. As you continue practicing vocabulary through reflection, storytelling, and real-life situations, your English gradually becomes more expressive and natural. Instead of relying on basic words repeatedly, you begin using a wider range of expressions that help you communicate your ideas more clearly. Remember that vocabulary improvement is a gradual process. Each new word you learn becomes part of your communication toolkit. The more you practice describing experiences, sharing opinions, and reflecting on your journey, the stronger your English will become. Take a moment now to describe your learning journey in English. You might say, learning English has been a rewarding experience. Or you might say, this journey has helped me grow and improve. Or perhaps, every day of practice brings me closer to fluency. Practicing these reflections helps strengthen both your vocabulary and your confidence. Let's continue deepening your vocabulary by focusing on how advanced English speakers describe ideas, situations, and everyday experiences with clarity and nuance. At higher levels of English, communication becomes less about simply stating facts and more about explaining thoughts, observations, and interpretations. This is where vocabulary truly becomes powerful, because the words you choose allow you to express subtle meanings and precise ideas. Think about a situation where someone asks you to explain how you feel about your progress in learning English. A very basic response might be, "My English is better now." While that sentence is correct, it does not capture the full experience. Instead, you might say, "Psych, I can clearly see the progress I've made." Another possibility could be, "I've noticed a significant improvement in my confidence." Or you might say, "My ability to express ideas in English has improved greatly." These expressions communicate progress in a more thoughtful and natural way. Imagine describing a moment when you realized that your English had improved. Instead of saying, "I understood more today," you might say, "Today I realized how much my listening skills have improved." Another option could be, "I noticed that I was able to understand conversations more easily." Or you might say, I found myself following the conversation without difficulty." These expressions show awareness of personal progress. Let's practice a short reflection moment together. Imagine someone asks you about your experience practicing English regularly. You might say, "Practicing consistently has helped me improve steadily." Another possibility could be, "Daily practice has strengthened my vocabulary and confidence." Or you might say, "Regular practice has made a noticeable difference in my fluency." Practicing sentences like these helps you express reflections clearly. Another important aspect of advanced vocabulary is describing observations about the world around you. When people talk about what they notice or observe, they often use words that describe patterns and understanding. Instead of saying, "I see many people learning English," you might say, "I've noticed that many people are learning English." Another possibility could be, "It seems that more people are interested in learning English." Or you might say, "There appears to be a growing interest in learning English." These expressions sound thoughtful and analytical. Imagine discussing the importance of communication in modern life. Instead of saying, "Communication is important," you might say, "Effective communication plays a crucial role in modern life." Another option could be, "Strong communication skills are essential in today's world." Or you might say, "The ability to communicate clearly is extremely valuable." These expressions are common in advanced English discussions. Let's practice again. Imagine explaining why learning languages matters. You might say, "Learning languages allows people to connect with others across cultures." Another possibility could be, "Language learning helps people understand different perspectives." Or you might say, "Knowing multiple languages opens doors to new opportunities." These sentences communicate meaningful ideas clearly. Another useful group of vocabulary involves describing habits and routines. Many conversations involve talking about daily habits that help people improve. Instead of saying, "I practice every day," you might say, "I maintain a daily practice routine." Another possibility could be, "I make time every day to practice." Or you might say, "Consistent practice has become part of my routine." These expressions describe habits more naturally. Imagine explaining how you study English regularly. Instead of saying, I study every day, you might say, I dedicate time every day to studying English. Another option could be, studying English has become part of my daily routine. Or you might say, I consistently set aside time to practice my English. These expressions sound organized and intentional. Let's practice another reflection moment. Imagine someone asks how you stay motivated while learning English. You might say, I stay motivated by reminding myself of my goals. Another possibility could be, I stay motivated by focusing on my progress. Or you might say, I stay motivated because I enjoy seeing improvement. These expressions show a thoughtful mindset. Another powerful vocabulary skill involves describing achievements and milestones. As you improve in English, you will reach certain milestones that represent progress. Instead of saying, see, I did something good, you might say, I reached an important milestone. Another possibility could be, I achieved something meaningful. Or you might say, I accomplished something I once thought was difficult. These expressions highlight success. Imagine describing the moment when you successfully spoke English in a conversation. Instead of saying, I spoke English well, you might say, I managed to communicate confidently in English. Another option could be, I had a successful conversation in English. Or you might say, I expressed my ideas clearly in English. These expressions show achievement and confidence. Let's practice again. Imagine you successfully understand a conversation between native speakers. You might say, I was able to follow the conversation easily. Another possibility could be, I understood the discussion without difficulty. Or you might say, I was able to grasp the main ideas quickly. These sentences communicate comprehension clearly. Another advanced vocabulary skill involves describing balance and contrast in situations. Life often includes both positive and challenging experiences. Instead of saying, it was hard but good, you might say, it was challenging but rewarding. Another possibility could be, it was difficult but worthwhile. Or you might say, it required effort, but the result was satisfying. These expressions sound natural and thoughtful. Imagine describing your learning journey. Instead of saying, learning English is hard, you might say, learning English can be challenging but extremely rewarding. Another option could be, the journey requires patience, but the results are worth it. Or you might say, the process takes time, but the progress is meaningful. These expressions reflect a balanced perspective. Let's practice one more reflection exercise together. Imagine you are thinking about your progress so far. You might say, the journey has been challenging but fulfilling. Another possibility could be, the process requires effort, but the improvement is satisfying. Or you might say, every step of learning brings me closer to fluency. These expressions sound thoughtful and inspiring. Another important group of vocabulary involves describing clarity and understanding. As learners progress, they often talk about how their understanding becomes clearer over time. Instead of saying, now I understand, you might say, now everything makes more sense. Another possibility could be, my understanding has become much clearer. Or you might say, I now have a clearer picture of how the language works. These expressions show intellectual progress. Imagine describing a moment when something finally becomes clear to you. Instead of saying, "I understand it now," you might say, "I finally grasp the concept." Another option could be, "The idea is much clearer to me now." Or you might say, "Everything makes sense now." These expressions are very common in learning environments. Let's practice one final reflection moment. Think about the progress you have made while listening and practicing English. You might say, "My vocabulary has expanded significantly." Another possibility could be, "My confidence in speaking English has increased." Or you might say, "Yeah, I feel more comfortable expressing my thoughts in English." These sentences help you recognize your progress. As your vocabulary continues to grow, something very important begins to happen. You start thinking in English more naturally. Instead of translating ideas from another language, you begin forming thoughts directly in English. This shift is one of the strongest signs that your fluency is improving. Vocabulary growth is not about memorizing thousands of words instantly. It is about gradually building a collection of expressions that allow you to communicate your thoughts clearly. Every conversation you practice, every sentence you create, and every reflection you make strengthens your ability to express yourself. Take a moment now and describe your learning journey in English using the vocabulary you have practiced. You might say, "This journey has helped me expand my vocabulary and improve my confidence." You might also say, "Every lesson brings new understanding and new opportunities to improve." Or you might say, "Step by step, my English is becoming stronger and more natural." Practicing sentences like these helps turn vocabulary into real communication. Thank you so much for spending your time learning and practicing English with me today. I truly hope this vocabulary masterclass helped you expand your English vocabulary and gave you many useful expressions that you can start using in your daily conversations. Remember, improving your English does not happen overnight, but every small step you take brings you closer to fluency. Every new word you learn, every sentence you practice, and every conversation you attempt strengthens your confidence and your ability to communicate clearly. The most important thing you can do after this lesson is continue practicing. Try using the vocabulary you learned today when you talk about your daily experiences. Describe, saw your day, share your thoughts, explain your plans, and reflect on your progress. The more you use these words in real situations, the more natural they will become. Over time, you will notice that expressing your ideas in English becomes easier and more comfortable. Always remember, fluency grows through consistency. Even a few minutes of daily practice can make a big difference over time. Listening carefully, repeating useful expressions, and speaking out loud will help your brain remember vocabulary more effectively. Each time you practice, you are training your mind to think more naturally in English. If you found this lesson helpful, make sure you continue learning with more English practice lessons like this. Keep exposing yourself to new vocabulary. Keep practicing conversations. And keep challenging yourself to express your thoughts in richer and more natural ways. With patience, dedication, and consistent effort, you will continue improving step by step. Once again, thank you so much for learning English with me today, and I look forward to practicing English together again very soon.